Yeah, so the rugby thing were like almost a disaster, and although it were um, I left through my own accord. I decided to walk away from the game because I'd just become really saturated with it, and Leeds had offered me really poor money over 4 years, and I felt like I were worth more than that, so I left. But I always viewed it as a failure, a massive failure. And it were really catastrophic, mate. And I just thought that unless I sort my life out, I'm going to end up in jail because I were constantly going out fighting. I were drinking, I like taking recreational drugs. And it were chaos. I'd like gone from this real disciplined and structured environment to nothing. And as a result, I were just all over the place. So I wanted to get into the Marines, but it was a massive risk, right? Because obviously, 1 in 1,000 chance of doing it. If I failed at that, I just thought, I am a catastrophic failure in life. So I was at that point thinking, who am I? Am I this guy? Am I capable, or am I a failure? Am I living in this illusion of who I am, who I think I am as a person? So when I went in, there were so many people as a consequence of my behaviour just prior thinking, oh, you'll be back in a month. You won't do this. You're going to end up being a Navy chef and just saying all this stuff. And believe it or not, mate, it made me so angry that that's what they thought of my character, that I was never ever going to let them ever going to allow that kind of validation, that external validation. So even when I lost motivation, which you do on all kind of hard goal and long goal acquisitions, I always came back to them, and I just thought, well, what's the alternative? I can't go back and massage their validation, give them that final say so they can laugh at me. So I just felt I had no option but to stay in and complete the job. And that's what I did, mate. And it's funny because I've been writing book 2 and looking at failure, and now through inverted thinking, when you look back and you're able to, you should use failure rather than loading value onto the end goal. That's all right doing that. And thinking of yourself, what you're going to get at the end of the goal, what you're going to get. But when you lose motivation, you lose that vision. Whereas what I've been researching is that when you look back at what it's going to be like if you fail at that endeavour and what you're going to kind of take on, that's more powerful in terms of your anchor of stability and keeping your in goal acquisition than loading value onto the end goal. And that's exactly what I stumbled across in training. It was such a powerful and stable anchor of stability, not wanting to validate external opinion. And that's basically, mate, when motivation went and I wanted to go home and I were hating life, I thought of that. That's where I landed, and that kept me in.
I've been reading a lot on like sports psychology lately, and it's kind of similar. Like you have that motivation, that value that drives you on, but in like when things are getting really tough, I was reading like how you can actually use hatred to try and spur you on that little bit more, and it's kind of similar. Yeah. It's like, you know, like it sounds a little bit negative, but you know, if you can find something.
It sounds very negative and very counterintuitive, but when you lose motivation and when you're under fatigue and the facade, this exterior facade falls off and we become vulnerable, and we all do under fatigue, right? The negative self-talk starts. And if you can get that negative self-talk to become anger, you get angry at it. And you've got some kind of passion in there that you're angry about, like, I'm not going to let them like have the last say. If you can get to that point, that will kind of drive you on like a second energy source.
Yeah.
And that's definitely what I found, mate. Like without a shadow of a doubt, that's what kept me going. I think unless you've not got some passion in the depths of despair, you're gonna quit.
Yeah.
There's got to be something that drives you at the bottom.
Yeah. It's probably not a state to live in, but when you really need to tap into it,
it can pull you out.
Yeah. Next up is a clip from our fantastic conversation with Dr. Phil Price, where we get into Zone 2 training.
Zone 2 training is essentially just low intensity training. on a single modality. As soon as you start moving around loads of different modalities, the body then requires it to move blood to all sorts of different areas. And that shunting of blood to particular areas, you know, the dilation of capillaries around the muscle to get blood to the area because it's carrying the oxygen it needs to help with the contraction. Then it becomes not really zone 2. You know, you're not really defining zone 2 just on heart rate. Typically, when it's low intensity, you're doing training, say it's a run, say it's a bike, is doing it around the area where you get that first inflection point where the lactate starts to rise. And why I say what I mean by around, there's several different ways you could define where it is zone 2, and some people have it before, some people have it just after. So just saying zone 2 is like, well, whereabouts, because clearly there's a physiological response happening there. And the idea of spending a lot of time in this area is just to improve blood flow to the working muscles. It helps improve cardiac output. It helps improve the ability of developing a steady state situation in your body where you have this homeostasis between the waste products that you generate from the aerobic processes and the ability for the body to use it or to remove it. So, for example, lactate isn't just like these waste products. Yeah, it gets removed by the blood, but at the same time, it's a signaling molecule. It can be broken down further for energy, et cetera, et cetera. So the body uses it as a really important molecule. So lots of zone 2 training can actually help our ability to recover. So that's why you hear a lot of people saying, you know, do a large volume of low intensity work, because it helps your ability to physiologically recover from the harder type of training that you will also do and probably do more of as you reach towards, I don't know, like a HYROX competition. So yeah, I think low intensity training is really, really quite important. So it's great to see it got a bit of a boom recently. Sometimes people go a bit too far with it, but you know, it's still important. And these booms often come from when people see things going a little bit wrong in the industry. And I think loads of people were to sort of like training at a really high intensity every day. And, you know, then all of a sudden they just don't have that ability to develop that base. So, you know, I was saying about that first lactate point, it then occurs really early. So for example, if I only trained at high intensity all the time, I'd have like what's known as a lactate threshold, which occurs really early in terms of if I had a graded exposure of intensity, if I was running. So my body will go straight away to using lactate and essentially carbohydrates for energy. So, well, you don't really need to do that because muscle glycogen is a limited store. Your ability to stay in that intensity level is limited as well. So why you don't really want that. You start to impair your ability to recover because the body goes straight to perceiving that low intensity work is high intensity work because they use the same processes to develop energy for it. So you don't want that. I've seen people say that they've seen similar responses to those that are diabetics in like CrossFit athletes that only train like 100% all the time. And that's not going to help you recover that well. And whether that affects your training long term or your ability to recover in a competition, but it's both going to have an impact.
Next up, we hear from elite HYROX athlete David Magida, who talks about where his mind goes during a really tough race.
I've become a bit of a different person during the race than I am afterwards. I think most guys would tell you like I'm pretty like jovial and friendly, and like I'm like a big into the brotherhood of the sport. Like I think that we are all going through this shared experience that is really hard and really challenging and special, and like I tremendously respect all of the guys that I race with and the work that they've put in. But during the race, I basically look at everybody as inferior. And so I, you know, if there's somebody running with me, I kind of am like chuckling to myself about how much of a wuss they are, or how, you know, like I'm not going to give that person an inch because I don't think they've worked harder than me. I don't think they're stronger than me. I don't think they're faster than me. I don't think they're tougher than me. And that's a lot of where it comes from. But I also, that's when you're in a war with one person. You have to believe that you are the superior athlete in that situation. At the same time, like, my mindset is that I'm not really racing other people because I'm not running their race. I'm running my race. And if I'm running my race, that means that I'm really only racing my clock and my splits. And so whether someone is really with me at a certain point doesn't really matter. Like, we don't get into nut crunching time until you're at like the farmer's carries and you're coming off that. And now you've got run into lunge and run into wall balls. Like, that's the only time you're really racing someone if you're being realistic about it. Before that, you're just setting the most sustainable, attainable tempo and pace for yourself. And whether someone is near you or not is really irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But say, like, let's talk about whatever, the end of that marathon that you ran. Presumably that was getting tough. You're not trying to win. You're not competing. Does it get, are you thinking about anything at that point?
Yeah, a couple things. That race in particular, I would say, was very, very mental. Like, I'm a big believer in like having mantras, repeating them to yourself. And my training partner, Mark Gadet, who's an Army Ranger, I still call him my training partner, even though he's lived in Colorado the last year and a half, 2 years. He told me before the race, he said, remember the age-old Army Ranger saying, DBAP, don't be a pussy, which I repeated to myself over and over and over during this race when I was struggling. And I remember I had a massive cramp in my hamstring, and I just like was screaming and dragging this leg, and I just rammed my thumb into it and screamed, you know, right in front of a lot of people. That was big mentally. And then I think the rest of it, honestly, man, like my daughter hadn't been born yet, but you know, I knew my wife was expecting, and I was running and I was looking at my ring on my finger, and I was thinking about my wife, and I was thinking about my daughter, and I wanted them to be proud of me. And so that is a big inspiration for me. Like getting to have my daughter there to when I won the US championships. Like, she won't remember it, but she was there, and I'll get to tell her about that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff, man. That's real. When you become a parent, it changes, your motivation changes like a lot. It's a lot of it becomes like setting an example for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And showing them like what you can do if you believe.
And work
for it and fight for it.
Next up is a clip from my conversation with the legendary CrossFit athlete Sam Briggs, where I ask her if she's got any favourite failures, anything that perhaps felt like a failure at the time, but now she looks back on as being not so disastrous and perhaps helped her throughout her career.
I think there's two that kind of like spring to mind. There's one where I've always been known to like run my own race. I kind of like, I don't feed off the other athletes that much. It's like, I kind of set my own pace, and I know what I'm capable of. And in the 2013 games, it was the first time legless rope climbs had ever like shown up at the games. And I love rope climbs. And one of the other athletes I knew would be good at it. And I could hear the commentator like talking about Selena Fortunato, and her nickname was Spider Monkey because she's so good at all events like that. And instead of like sticking to my own pace, I raced her. And this was an event that me or her should have taken kind of like first or second. And we both failed on the 7th rope climb, and neither of us got that rope climb or finished the event. Luckily for me, it didn't cost me like the games. But like, especially for Selena, those points could have put her on the podium. And it just kind of reinforced in my mind that it's like, right, okay, you don't race other people. This is about you. This is what you can do. you know what you can do. You know how fast you should have done those rope climbs to stick to what you know.
Yeah. I think that's bringing it back to Hyrox. I think that's something that some people can get caught up in Hyrox as well, like getting into a race, and you've all got different strengths and weaknesses through the race, and you all pace it differently. And if you go out hotter than you need to because someone else is doing the same, then that can ruin you as well. Yeah. How about the other one? You said there were two.
Yeah, obviously, I won the games in 2013, and then because of the handstand walk, I didn't make it back to the games in 2014. And as devastating as that was at the time, it's also like I missed 1 year at the games, and then I've competed 2015 right the way to 2021. Still did semi-finals in 2, and then obviously Masters this year. And it's one of those, it's like, was it really a failure? Because I still had another 9 years of competing there. It's like, I can't help but think, had I competed that year, that's the year that Cara Webb, or Cara Saunders, as she is now, sustained a neck injury, and she had to withdraw from competition that year. Luckily, it didn't ruin her career, and she was able to come back. But it's like, what if that had have happened to me, and what if I hadn't have been able to come back? So I might have made it in 2014, but that could have been my last year of competing. So it just makes me feel lucky for the actual span of my career rather than 1 year of competing.
Next, we hear from one of the greatest Ironman triathletes in the world shortly after he competed at Hyrox London, where I asked him some of his most favourite sporting experiences, and he tells us about the Sub-7 project.
Yeah, that was actually an incredible sporting experience, actually. I'd actually say, that was definitely a massive highlight. So that was basically they wanted to run a project to see whether or not you could complete an Ironman distance in under 7 hours. I think it came about because I'm sponsored by Bahrain Endurance, and I think after one of the races, because they have a half Ironman in Bahrain, and Mo Farah was out there, Mark Cavendish was out there, and obviously a lot of the top triathletes that were sponsored by Bahrain at the time were there. So like Jan Frodeno, who's like multiple world champion, Alistair Brownlee, like double Olympic champion. And they were all talking, I think, over dinner about what would be possible to do for an Ironman if you had the fastest swimmer, the fastest biker and the fastest like runner, like how fast could you go? And then I think the conversation veered towards, is it possible to go for to do a sub-7 Ironman if you had a team time trial like you get in the Tour de France, if you had some runners like helping pace you, like they did for like Kipchoge, for like breaking 2 and stuff like that, and like getting you water bottles and like, basically you make like the fastest course. And then that was what kind of got the Sub-7 project underway. And it was supposed to be Alistair Brownlee that was meant to be doing it. And I was actually originally going to be a pacer for him, but then injury ruled Alistair out. And then 8 days before the race, I got the call up to say, do you want to do it? Which is kind of like, I wasn't really thinking that I was going to be in shape for it, because I was actually coming back from COVID. I had COVID in May, and this was, I think, end of April, I had COVID. And this was when it was a bit worse. Now it's not really, it doesn't really seem that bad, does it? But so I wasn't in top form. And then there was that race, like they gave me 8 days notice, but I thought it'd be such a great opportunity. And I thought, if I don't take the opportunity, I'll regret that, probably for the rest of your life, because you'd be watching that on TV thinking, oh, why didn't I give it a go? So I was like, yeah, I'll give it a go. Wasn't sure if I'd go under 7 hours. But yeah, had a bad swim for me, but that was expected because I hadn't really been doing a massive amount of swimming in the build up. But the biking went absolutely phenomenal. Like, we had an awesome team. Like, with people that had rode the Tour de France before on the team, like Alex Dowsett, former world record holder for the hour, Dan Bigham, who's working with Team Ineos. Some of you guys, the listeners, might know them as like one of the top cycling teams in the world. So with some really good riders on the team, great expertise, and we managed to do an amazing run. Amazing bike. I started it ahead of the other guy who I was racing, which was the start of the run ahead of him. It was Christian Blumenfeld, who was like the Olympic champion and the reigning Ironman world champion at the time. I think I had about a 3-minute buffer, which for me was incredible, to considering the notice I'd got and the training I'd had leading into it. But unfortunately, he caught me on the run, beat me by 3 minutes, but we both went under 7 hours. I think I did 6 hours 47 in the end, but it was amazing. Like, and to be honest, like the performance that I did on the day for how I like from what I should have done with my fitness probably exceeded it. Like normally you end up going into an event, don't you? And you think, oh, I've trained so well and I just didn't perform. You know, I know I could have done better. Whereas that was actually like my training's been shocking. Like I don't know how I pulled that out the bag, but I'll take it. You know,
Amazing, awesome, and just to like drive home what you did on the bike, that was you essentially set a time that most people didn't even think would ever be possible, right? And like, what was your like average pace? Do you know what your average pace was over that distance?
Yeah. We averaged 55.5 kilometers an hour for 180 kilometers. So basically, I think it was like 34 miles per hour, which like if you try and ride that like on a bike for yourself for a bit, seems like pretty hard. And luckily we had some really good expertise on the team. So they worked out a great strategy, but it was like fairly hard, like even sitting on the back because of the little surges, and you had to just concentrate so hard on keeping the gap the smallest possible because of the energy you save from drafting. That I remember at one bit, we got with about 2 laps to go because it was round. We rode 16 or 20 kilometers to a circuit, and then it was round a circuit that was like a big oval, which they use for like testing of cars, I think. And the circuit must have been about 6 kilometers a lap, something like that, 6-7 kilometers. And I think we got to like 1 lap to go, and one of the guys, like Harry Tanfield, I think one of them said, "All right, we only got 1 lap to go now. Let's up it. And I was like, no, like knock it back a bit. Like I don't want to go any harder because I've got to run a marathon afterwards. But like it was quite for him because he was only doing the cycling bit. He was obviously thinking like, let's up it. We've got 7 Ks to go. Let's rip it up. And I'm thinking, I don't even know if I'm going to get around the marathon.
Next, we hear from Jake Williamson. Jake is one of the age group world record holders at the time of recording in the men's open in Hyrox. In this clip, he talks about his experience coming out as a gay man in the world of sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's still one of the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and that's why I have such a big push in terms of helping other people with it, especially in sort of worlds like football and like Hyrox, for example, it's quite a masculine sport, isn't it? You're trying to be the best. You're trying to be almost the fittest person in the planet. It's quite macho, so it's like it's almost breaking down stereotypes within the sporting world. And I was speaking about it last weekend. Like there's not a Premier League player that's come out as gay, and it's like, how are we still at that stage? So it's like, I mean, it means a lot to me because I've come through it. I've come out the other side, and I'm like quite happy and comfortable. But at the time, it was almost impossible to even say the words. And it's like anyone listening to this in the sport of Hyrox or in the sport, like I was at Strive on the weekend and at Forders with my partner, quite happily, like holding hands, walking around, feeling comfortable. And it's like, it's trying to show that you can be in a sport like Hyrox, but also come out at the same time. So yeah, I mean, it was flipping difficult. And I think my message to anyone is to just kind of be accepting and be the person that someone would want to come out to as well, especially when they're in a sporting world. It can feel quite like you're on your own. So trying to reduce the stigma and allow people to do both at the same time.
Do you feel like obviously like just doing what you do and talking about it and everything helps and probably encourages others to do the same? Do you feel like there's anything on the sporting side that like football needs to do different, or even Hyrox, seeing as this is a Hyrox podcast?
It's tough because I remember seeing like the Rainbows and Rainbow Laces campaign when I was in the closet, and I would almost run away from it. Like I didn't want anything to be a part of it. So it's a really tough thing to say. You need to do more because we don't really know what the answer of doing more is. I think the biggest thing is just kind of shining a light on excellence within the gay community, which is hard because there's not that many people that are out, because we've made it really difficult to come out as a whole. But yeah, it's just celebrating stories and allow it. Like it's so normal, just like allowing me to have this conversation on the podcast with you. It's like it could help, even if it helps one person, it makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I think it's almost just making it as normal and as natural as possible. But it's something I was going to say anyway. It would be nice to see some more diversity within Hyrox anyway. It's quite a white sport. Like you don't see too many people of ethnic minorities involved in the sport. So I think it would be nice to have a push on that regard anyway, just as a whole, because sport, again, as we know, is for everyone, and everyone should be encouraged to come and play and get involved. So yeah.
Next is a clip from Brent Fikowski, one of the top CrossFitters in the world, where I ask him what he does differently to other CrossFitters that helps perhaps to improve his performances in the sport.
I think something that I do well, and I would say even some athletes that do well or even do better, have better trophy cases than me, I think I do better than them, is I do a really good job of like resetting after each workout, and just because I think sometimes, and this is partially, I think I realized it's because of how the media and the culture of CrossFit like reports on and portrays the sport. Every workout is, I mean, we know this, but in practice, people don't practice this, I don't think mentally, is every workout's very different, right? So when I go to a competition, there's going to be some workouts where it's like, I should be able to win this, right? Like, this is a good event for me. This needs to be a top finish. If I, so for me, when I go to competition, I'm usually trying to podium because it's usually where I can end up if I do well. So it's like, all right, like if I'm going to podium at this competition, like I need to win, for me, it would be a workout with swimming and wall balls and rope climbs. And, it's like, that's a great workout for Brent. Like, I got to find a way to win this or come top 3. Because I need those points. Whereas if there's a workout with like heavy deadlifts, strict handstand push-ups, maybe like dips in a vest or something, it's like, okay, like, do your best. Are you going to win this? No, right? Like you're whatever. And so I think what sometimes happens is people know that, like we all know that, but when you're at a competition, you can see the like demeanor of an athlete. They can get really down on themselves. Let's say it's day 1 is finished and they're sitting in like 15th place and they're like, oh man, like 15th. And it's like, yeah, but like those 2 events were bad for you. So relax. But I feel like I'm pretty, I try to be pretty stoic about that sort of thing. It's like, hey, I mean, every single workout's different. And a lot of like those roller coaster of the points is largely dependent on the order of the events and the type of the events. And don't get too wrapped up in like the emotions of like seeing those slips and then the rises and the falls of your points total relative to everyone else, because it's like that is going to happen. Like it's the nature of the game. It's like it's inevitable. It's not like other sports. But when the media announces on it, they announce on it like other sports where it's like, oh, after 2 events, this guy's in the leader's jersey. He's the guy to beat. Look out for him. It's like he's not the guy to beat, and maybe he is, but it's like he just happened to be really good at the first 2 things. And then, that person slides to maybe 10th or 5th or 3rd or maybe wins. It's like, what do you do? Like, that's not, so, they're creating that perception in that athlete's mind and everyone else's. And then it's like, it's false, right? It's not really the real story.
Yeah.
That's something I think I do mentally, specifically, that's fairly specific to this sport. But I'm sure there's guys in High Rocks where it's like, oh, like this guy we all know is really good at High Rocks, but the first 2 stations are his worst stations.
Yeah.
So he's always like, oh, he's coming from behind. It's like, he's not really coming from behind, like it's like his worst 2 stations are his first 2 stations and like always will be. But if you switch the order of the stations every time you did it, then you'd be like, oh man, that guy had a slow finish. He just, what a wimp. It's like, no, like his worst 2 stations are the last 2. So everyone caught up to him, but really that's not the story, right?
Next is a clip from my episode with rugby league legend Jamie Peacock, where he talks about his get off the bus mantra.
So good, just story around self-belief that I obviously now I know that, to succeed in life, when we feel a bit of nerves and feel a bit of self-doubt, that's a good thing, right? Because we're in a good situation. And we're in a situation where whatever's making us feel nervous or doubtful, if we can push through it, that's where our greatest accomplishments come from, right? Take it back to High Rocks. I think there were thousands of people in there felt really nervous, but come the other end of it, an hour and a half later, it's one of the greatest experiences they've ever had. And that's what life's about. But when I was younger, I got offered a trial at the Bradford Bulls when I was nearly 19 years of age. And I was really nervous about doing it, didn't have much self-confidence, to the point, you know, I caught the bus from where I lived in Leeds up to Bradford, and on the bus journey, got more and more nervous. Got to my bus stop and I bottled it. I stayed on the bus. Now I stayed on the bus till it frigging terminated in Halifax. I had to get off the bus at this point. So I've got off this bus and thinking, you know, I've blown my big opportunity here to you know, sign professionally. So anyway, you know, I thought, what do I do? I ring my dad. Spoke to my dad, you know, he was a bit pissed with me, you know. I'll be straight, taught me some new swear words, Greg, when he spoke to me that day. But he said, you know, come home and we'll have a chat. And on the way home, I thought to myself, do you know what? I've got a lot of people around me believe me, but the one person who has to believe in themselves is me. So I came up with a mantra, time to get off the bus, because I thought, if I get another chance, I've got to get off this bus. Got home, spoke to my dad. Dad said, you give me one more chance, which meant then all week, I told myself, time to get off the bus, time to get off the bus. You're good enough to go train with the Bradford Bulls. Following week, jump on a bus, keep telling myself this mantra, get to my bus stop, and I go train with the first team, do the trial period. It was really tough and intense, Greg. You know, it's elite sport, but it was nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. And we all know that's what happens when we confront our biggest fears, right? Mm-hmm. And I learned a lesson that day that self-doubt is normal. Negative talk can be managed, and you just need to believe in yourself. So then, throughout my time in sport, in rugby league, I use that message every time you up a level, because every time you up a level, you're going to get a bit of self-doubt with it. And, you know, the best example I can give it was when I first got picked to play against Australia. So if you're listening and you don't know rugby league, Australia have been the world's best team for the last 60 years. You know, they are the world benchmark. You know, better than the All Blacks in South Africa put together if you follow the other one. But so my first game for Great Britain was against the Australians. And I was nervous all week, but told myself, time to get off the bus, time to get off the bus. You're good enough to be there. And I scored a try in under 2 minutes in the game. Got into the game and we beat the Aussies that day against all the odds. So it shows you how I use that lesson throughout my career. And it's one that anybody can kind of use, that you got to get off the bus in life if you want to achieve anything.
Yeah, love it, love it. Funnily enough, like, to take it back to HYROX again, you see, like, there's a Facebook group where people put up tickets for sale, and you see as the event approaches, like, all these tickets come up for sale, and sometimes it's for injury, fair enough, but I start to suspect a lot of the time it's just like they're nervous and they're worried and they're not ready and all that stuff. Yeah. And I think you know, since I heard you talk about this mantra, I think a lot of people could do with telling themselves, like, it's time to get off the bus, and then just go and do it. And like the experience that you get and the value that you get from just doing one, even if you're not really ready for a HYROX, like it stands you in good stead for the future, you know? Yeah, you're absolutely right. They should do it, and generally it'll come down with undertrained, but they'll undertrained. They've entered it and then thought, I can't do it. But I said, what they'll get out of it for just trying to push themselves, even though they've undertrained and completing it, will be so much more than going taking the easy option and selling it on Facebook. It's too easy to take the easy option in life. Better taking the harder option, be nervous, push yourself, and, you know, through the other side of it, you'll get something from it.
Next is a clip from my episode with Big Bad Bobby D. He's an Australian athlete. He's a very impressive guy, and amongst many other things has coached several CrossFit Games athletes. Before I spoke to him, I asked James Newbury, who he has coached, if there's anything I should talk to him about, and he said make sure to ask him about the Airdyne workout that they did when they first met in 2014.
Yeah, I first met James maybe 2013 when I was living in Queensland, and that's where we kind of struck up an athlete coach relationship. We had to move back down to Sydney to expand our gym that we actually owned, the physical premises. And James at that time was living in Adelaide. So when I first decided to, when we first agreed to coach, he flew up to visit me in Sydney, and I had an old rattly Schwinn Airdyne from probably 1985 or something like that. It was a real rackety piece of work. This was kind of just before the assault bikes, and I don't think he'd ever ridden one before. So I just got out the little whiteboard, first exposure. I think we did there's around 7 sets of 30 seconds max effort assault bike, or Airdyne I should say. And at about after effort 4, I think we had an extra 5 or 6 minutes rest, just to keep that intensity up, and then we went again. And I think everyone knows what assault bikes are these days, but when you haven't seen one before, it's you only get one exposure to it for the first time. And yes, I think intensity was a new level for him that day. And yeah, there was lots of blue lips, pale faces, and it wasn't the coolest day either. So when we eventually finished with wobbly legs, I'm pretty sure we sat in the pool for the rest of the afternoon and didn't really talk to each other.
If so, I was thinking if you can, that was in 2014. He said, so if that's like, if you can remember a workout from 9 years ago, it was serious.
Well, yeah, considering James, like, he's so versatile, he's done so many things. So to remember one little hit out in a garage with all the things that he's done and places he's been, it's got to be memorable.
Yeah, nice.
Next is a clip from my interview with Ryland Shadegg. He's one of the top Hyrox elite athletes. In this clip, we talk about how he trained around an injury when he couldn't really run, and also talk about training intensities.
Firstly, like you mentioned your injury, your foot injury. I think you were unable to run much for a long time, but clearly you can run now to a good standard. Do you feel like was that just work on the ergs, work on the bike that has transferred over to running?
So honestly, if I only did erg work, I would probably go crazy with the amount of volume I was trying to do, because I can only be inside for so much time. Like, I think my longest rowing and ski erg session is a session called Death by Ski Erg, or Death by Assault Bike, or Death by Rower. And those ones only take me about 45 minutes. And those are really my longest ski erg and rowing sessions. But you put me outside on a mountain bike or on a road bike, and like, I did quite a few 5 to 7 hour rides, and a lot of 2 to 4 hour rides, like a ton of sub-threshold work. I think it's interesting how you can see the trends in social media. Like, everyone's like, oh, Zone 2 is incredible right now. And 5-10 years ago, it's like, oh, HIIT training is incredible. And, before that, it's like, oh, Zone 3 is incredible. Kind of like diets. It's like you have the Atkins diet from way back when, which is essentially the same thing as the keto diet, just recycled in a different name. And it's so funny to me because, like, right now, people are like, Zone 2, Zone 2, Zone 2. And I'm like, yes, Zone 2 is great. But also, like, sub-threshold training, which is technically like the gray zone that people are trying to avoid. Sub-threshold training is what I did a ton of, because Hyrox needs a ton of ability at that, like, at threshold, and to produce less waste, but also still continue to work on your threshold. Sub-threshold training is incredible. So, like, I would do an hour to an hour and a half of sub-threshold work on my bike on a lot of days when I couldn't run. And then the next day I would do maybe, it depended on what part of the cycle I was in. But that's a lot of, like, Zone 3 work. And then I also did, all of my running was pretty much Zone 5 and above, because I couldn't run far and I couldn't really manage the pain for long. And then I also do a lot of Zone 2 and Zone 1, depending on the time frame. So if I'm trying to build volume, I'll do it first through, like, Zone 2 training. And that's another thing. Like, a lot of people I see on social media or whatever, they'll be like walking on a treadmill and call it Zone 2. And I'm like, if you're in Zone 2 from walking, you got a different problem. Like, Zone 2 for me is between 136 and 157 beats per minute. Or it actually, I think it's 140 to 157. I'd have to have my zones pulled up. It depends if I'm running or biking, but that's like the general location of my Zone 2. And for me to be there, man, like, I've got to be running. For me to be at 140 beats per minute, I've got to be probably around 730 pace per mile or below. And it depends on fitness, of course. Like, as your fitness goes up, the mile time drops. But so I actually do very little Zone 2 running, And on the bike, I have to be at about 250 watts to be in zone 2, 250 to 260. And so I actually, I maybe do one zone 2 session a week, because I do a lot of high end, and then I do a lot of zone 1, and then I'll do sub threshold. And so zone 2, if I'm in about 3 weeks, I'll start doing a lot of zone 2 because my season will be over. But in my build phases and in my peak phases, I do very little zone 2, and it's a lot of threshold and zone 1, or VO2 max and zone 1, or sub threshold mixed with VO2 max and zone 1 recovery the next day. Because if I'm constantly asking my body to do a lot, eventually I'm just going to get sick and burn out.
So the zone 1 work, are you thinking of as it's like a recovery?
Yeah, it's a recovery. Yeah, like an hour on the bike at like 200 watts. Like I'll literally put a limit for myself. I'll be like, I'm not going to go above 250 watts on this ride. Like on all the climbs, on all the flats, everything. You know, I'll have fun taking my bike off some jumps and hitting corners and all that. Like I'll have a good time, but on all the climbs, I'm going to keep it below 250 watts because this is a recovery session. And then same on the ski erg and on the rower. If I'm going for just to like get some time on the machine so my body's familiar, if it's a recovery session, I'm not going to pull faster than like 2 minutes per 500. Like that's starting to put me into zone 2. And if it's a recovery session, I'm not trying to recover at zone 2. If it's like an actual recovery day for me, which I think people have different terminology for recovery day. I almost never take a complete day off. My recovery day is an hour of easy movement on the bike, an hour easy run, or like 30 minutes easy run, 30-minute bike, an hour on the ski erg / rower. Like usually I'll mix them all together, but it's all easy, like super easy.
Next up is a clip from my episode with Chris Hinshaw. This was one of my most popular episodes of the year. In this particular clip, he talks about coaching and taking risks in sport.
If you always play it safe, you know what's going to happen is you're always going to be mediocre. And what we as coaches must do is we must encourage athletes to take risk. We must make them realize that that's where their greatness will sit. And, you know, I think that coaches don't realize the power that they have. Most athletes are afraid of failing. Well, what if you're a coach that tells that athlete, I realize that this is difficult. I realize that if you're doing a mile for time, that last lap around the track, I realize you're in a non-sustainable pace. I realize you're suffering, but I'm encouraging you to take that risk because this is how you're going to take on more risk. And with that, you create even a higher level of confidence. You know, I think back early on about like myself as an athlete. I was a skinny little kid and I wasn't good at anything. You know, when I was 15, 16 years old, I was late in developing, and my brother was, Jesus, you know, he was a grown man by the time he was 13. And it was hard growing up in that space. And I had a dad who was also very challenging and expected things that I thought were just incredibly unreasonable. It really, as a kid, it impacted me in a negative way. But I remember watching the Hawaiian Ironman Kona on TV, and I'm there watching it with my dad, and the way that they film and present the Ironman, they present it in a way where it's so darn motivating. They make it in a way where it's like, I know it's impossible, right? It's a 2.4 mile ocean swim. It's a 112 mile bike ride across the lava fields of Hawaii. And then that marathon is in the heat of the day. I mean, it's not starting at 4 a.m. It's in the worst, most brutal time. But it's so beautifully presented that as a 17-year-old, as I'm watching it, I thought to myself, I'm not good in sport, but man, if I did that event, if I was able to finish it, then that would be mine, and no one would take it from me, and I would get some respect. And it came out of me, and I said it out loud. And there's my dad who's sitting next to me. It's just the two of us. And imagine the power that he has in that moment, right? And that's what a coach has, this power. Imagine if he was condescending to me, like if he was disrespectful in some way, if he was sarcastic. I would have cowered, but he didn't. He in the one moment that I needed him, and this is how I feel as a coach. When I really needed him, he delivered. He looked over at me and he says, let's make that happen. And he shouldn't have said it because I've never done anything remotely close to doing that. But what he said was, you're going to take a substantial risk and you are going to suffer. And you may fail, but I respect that effort, and I'm going to support you on it. And I that was a moment in my life that changed my entire trajectory, because he encouraged me to take that risk. And that's what I'm talking about. And it doesn't matter who you are, you have to take risk in your fitness. Otherwise, you're always going to wake up and you're always going to be mediocre. You're always going to underperform. And that's what I take into with everybody that I coach is, I realize that you're walking in the door and you're afraid. I realize that you're nervous, but I want you to know that I'll never mock you. I'll never be condescending to you. I'll never be disrespectful, because I know what that is like. And I know if I can get you to take that risk and have some courage, what sits for you on the other side. And that's what I think a coach's true role is to improve the quality of their life because of the experiences in doing the unknown.
Next is a clip from my recent interview with world champion and world record holder in Hyrox, Hunter McIntyre, where he talks about how he approached the race in Stockholm, where he broke his own world record slightly differently to perhaps what he's done in the past.
Yeah, I sat down with my coach and, we looked at stuff, and we had barely got to, I'd known him for a long time, but we had barely worked together. And he goes, "Hey man, I just want you to run way faster and see what happens." And I was like, God, I don't really want to fuck up my first race of the year, dude. And he's just like, "Just do it." I was like, all right, whatever. Got nothing to lose. And like, we did the math. We were really trying to hold 320Ks. And I think I was holding 323 to 328. And, it's impossible to tell with these courses. It could be a foot or two short, whatever. But it was pretty consistent. And the idea is like, we're just looking at the math, or it's like, hey man, like, you're going to get the most. If we could just pull 5 seconds off per run, you're just immediately 40 seconds off, which I basically was. And he goes, you're just going to have to see what happens in the stations. And so if you think about it, I'm usually going in at threshold. So like, let's just say my heart rate max is here. Like, I'm going in at threshold, which is a couple inches below the line. And I'm showing up to stations, and I'm just being this bulldog at the stations. I'm skiing faster than everybody. I'm pushing faster than everybody, pulling, doing burpees. And usually near the end of the race, I just kind of start to let go because I've already got the lead that I need, and there's no point in doing extra damage. This, I was just like, push your absolute limits at like your mile repeat pace and just go and see what happens. And I would show up to the stations, just feel like shit, awful. And that's probably part of the reason why I was so sore also. And my legs were dead. My lungs were dead. Like, I felt like I was glued to the ground on the burpees. But it worked out.